This is Jay, and this is a special episode we're going to release through Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. To be clear, this episode is not about politics or social movements and falls outside of what we usually do here. Today, Hanif Abdurraqib and I will be talking about Daniel Dumile, better known as MF Doom. Like lots of people, we were really sad to hear of Doom's passing and just wanted to reflect on his life and some of the many things that we will remember about Doom. My partner in this dialogue is Hanif Abdurraqib, a poet, essayist, and cultural critic from Columbus, Ohio. His books include The Crown Ain't Worth Much, They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us, Go Ahead in the Rain, Notes to a Tribe Called Quest, A Fortune for Your Disaster, and his forthcoming book, A Little Devil in America, which you can pre-order now. Rest in peace, Doom. So, before we get started, I guess I'll say a couple words. You know, this is obviously not a traditional Millennials Are Killing Capitalism episode. MF Doom passed away back in October, it sounds like. And that news didn't break until December 31st. I guess part of what I would say is just that he was a very important artist and kind of figure for me on a lot of levels. There's, I guess, one way to say it is that I used to collect CDs, and at a certain point, I had probably 1,500 or 1,600 CDs. And jewel cases are one of the things that over time my wife was like, this is ridiculous. And so when during one of my cross-country moves, I had to get rid of like 99% of my jewel cases. And among the 25 or so that I kept are all of MF Doom's albums. So, you know, just like, I guess on a personal level, through his art and through, you know, I think just what he meant to me individually, he's just an important artist. I mean, I talked to Josh. Josh was cool of using the space to have a conversation about Doom, you know, and I thought about people I would want to have a conversation about Doom with. Hanif came to mind. So welcome to the show, Hanif.
Thanks for having me, and thanks to you and Josh both for opening up the space for this. I'm a big fan of the podcast, and thankful that I get to kind of play a role in it this way.
So I think one of the ways that we could kind of start the conversation is just say, you know, Hanif, how did you first encounter Zev Love X? What was your first interaction with Doom or with KMD?
It was Mr. Hood. It was the album Mr. Hood by KMD. Although, of course, you know, that came out when I was, I don't know, maybe like 8 or 9. But I mean, the thing that I always talk about with music fandom is that I had the blessing of having older siblings, which meant that, you know, my older brother would play the KMD album, and I understood it. Of course, I didn't know what a concept album was by definition at that age, but I did understand it structurally as something different than what I'd been hearing. You know, it had this kind of, you know, Mr. Hood is the kind of central character that ties the concept together, and Mr. Hood's voice is kind of made up of these spliced instructional video audio clips. And it was just weird. You know, it was like, the big single was Peach Fuzz, I remember being, and I think I vaguely recall the music video for it. And it was just a different kind of album that I gravitated towards, even though I didn't understand what was happening on it or the attempted messaging or any of the actual nuts and bolts of that. I didn't understand until much later. But it was an inviting album for me because I was someone who loved story arcs and conceptual things. That's why I loved De La Soul Was Dead around the same age, you know, because I didn't fully understand the album, but I understood how an album could be tied together through story and through narrative.
Yeah, I think, you know, when you think about artists to compare for folks who aren't familiar with KMD, like, I do think that there's 3 groups that kind of come to mind for me. One of them is definitely De La Soul. And I think there's a lot of interesting kind of ways, like a lot of times we think about Doom as an MC primarily, even though people recognize what a you know, significant contribution he's done in terms of production. He's done a lot of production albums for other people and produced on big Ghostface, other people, right? But I think So I think De La Soul, but what I was going to say is I think, there's a bit of Prince Paul, right, in there too, right? Like there's a certain
Yeah.
vibe that the De La Soul albums have with Prince Paul. And I think that, Doom kind of brings that throughout from the KMD era all the way through his work, really. And like the humor of that, right? Like the thing about KMD is it's like they have a way of dealing with serious topics, but having, this kind of humorous way of doing it at the same time. And I think, the other two I would probably throw in there is like Black Sheep and
Mm-hmm.
and then a little bit of Brand Nubian, not so much style, but because of like the way that they incorporated 5% Nation iconography in their videos, like there's just sort of there's a relationship there, and obviously they were both part of like a loose knit kind of group that also included leaders of the new school that called themselves the God Squad. But I do think that De La Soul is probably the closest, and I think they're definitely sort of following very much in that vein with Mr. Hood.
Yeah. I also, for me, as I got older and spent more time with it and understood the political nature of it, and to be fair, what I think I like most about Mr. Hood and how it's held up is that it does feel like some young cats who were just trying to kind of figure out where they stand or what their political landscape is in doing that in real time. But it's also a debut album, and I think that's important. I think it's important that for me, even at the time when I think debut albums were debut hip hop albums, almost just by virtue of being debut hip hop albums in that era, were a point of risk. I think risks were being taken in big ways on those albums, but it's a risky debut album, and DJ Subrock's production on that album is stunning. It still holds up to me now, and I that cannot be lost either, of course.
Yeah, and it was interesting to me to hear the relationship between Zev and his brother. We'll use Zev interchangeably with Doom probably throughout this, but just for people who don't know this well, like Zev Love X was what Daniel Dumile went by during the KMD years, and then later he goes by Doom and various other monikers as well. But the relationship between Zev and Subrock, who were brothers, was that like Doom would produce things and write things and record to like, maybe like 60, 70, 80% completion. And then Subrock would do all of the like mixing, polishing, additional production work, like
sampling too, like putting the samples on.
Yeah. Right. And I think it was a lot of it was also like a lot of the story of Doom, I think, is about like the technologies that he was working with. Right. And I think that, there's a lot of different equipment. A lot of what Doom worked with over the years, all the way through his career, was like pretty lo-fi, old school analog equipment. Subrock was much more refined in terms of the quality and the technical, So if you compare KMD production to like later Doom production, like you notice a marked difference. It comes down to like levels of like mixing and mastering, but also the quality of it. If you play it on, it's just a much cleaner, like finished product. And I think that's, it's an interesting thing. And I think we can talk about it a little bit later on too, but like, Doom continuing without that, right, changes some things in terms of like the way that his work comes out to the world.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I will also say about Mr. Hood is that it's just a real masterclass in skits. And I know that, it came out in an era where skits were just really robust and brilliant all the way through, kind of the entirety of hip hop music. But I think it's a real masterclass in skits.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and so for me, interestingly, like the real entry point for all of this was like 99, 2000 probably. And part of that has to do with where I grew up and how I grew up. So I lived in the woods in Oregon. And I didn't have MTV when KMD was out, right? So, and they certainly weren't playing KMD in Southern Oregon on the radio. And so I really didn't get introduced to any of this music until, I got the internet probably in like 95, 96. Really started to get into like music on the internet in the late 90s. And even then, I had this will sound crazy to people nowadays, but I had a like 14.4 connection because it went through the phone lines back then. We didn't have cable internet. And so I would have to like sneak up into my parents' room where the computer was and set things to like download on Napster or go on some message board or whatever. And, it might take a couple hours for a song to download.
Yep.
And my parents would pick up the phone, right, to like make a phone call and hear the sound of the modem and start yelling at me and telling me, to get off the computer and all of this. And so, my introduction to Doom was first through that world. Like I remember when I bought Doomsday on a trip we took down to San Francisco, and there's an Amoeba Music in San Francisco in the Haight-Ashbury district. That's I hope it's still there. It was one of the coolest record stores in the world. And, they had Operation Doomsday, which I knew by that time was like not very many places. Like it was always sold out online, and the people were talking about it a lot. And so I bought that. I remember I had bought the MF Grimm, MF Doom collaboration EP from Brick Records. I'd bought that on Sandbox Automatic, which was this internet like clearinghouse for independent records back then, independent hip hop. So that was like my introduction. And then, when they put out Black Bastards, which we'll talk about next, but that got put out as they finally released it basically in the same era. And I was able to buy that like as soon as it came out. And there was a Mr. Hood reissue that came out about that time that I bought as well. So I kind of got introduced to all of those kind of 4 albums at the same time and became a big fan at that point. But we should backtrack for a second and talk a little bit about the second KMD album and Sub Rock's death as well. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if you want to share any of what you think about that story or share some of that context.
Yeah, what's funny is I remember there was like this before Black Bastards like officially got released. There was this kind of EP that had the demo tracks on it, or some kind of like rare unreleased demos that came out in 1998, I want to say. And I only remember this so distinctly because at the time I was like old enough to buy my own music. I had kind of crossed that threshold, and, my family, I didn't grow up with a lot of money, but I would always kind of budget for one album purchase every couple weeks or so. And there was still a tape spot. There was still the B&B Records on the east side of Columbus, tape and record spot. And I remember they had like one copy of it, maybe. And I don't know, no one knew how they got the copy, but it was this hot commodity. It was like whispered, or, it was like there was this whisper network of this KMD rarity thing. And I never heard it. I never got it, obviously. I don't know who got it. But I had heard about, Black Bastards and these demos from it.
Yeah.
Since 1998.
And that release was put out by Fondulum Records too. So we'll get into that, I think, a little bit as we get into Doomsday. But part of the reason it's so rare is because like Bobbito had a label, Bobbito Garcia from the Stretch and Bobbito show, and he released things primarily on 12-inch vinyl. But they probably were like some cassettes or some bootlegs of stuff or whatever. But yeah, it would have circulated very sparsely. Similar, honestly, to like the first pressing of Operation Doomsday. I think they said 3,000 copies were made, right? So these are small presses initially.
Which I do think, I mean, around that time, so when I was working on the Tribe book and I was talking to folks in New York about just New York hip hop, particularly in the late 90s, there was something interesting to me. I talked to someone who told me this story about Doom's reemergence, after he had been kind of off the radar since Sub Rock's passing and mourning and really kind of struggling to get by. And it was about how he had begun to, around 97 or 98, had started to resurface at the New Yorican, doing kind of at their open mic nights, spitting here and there, but wearing a stocking over his face, over like most of his face, right? Obscuring at least from the nose up. And that, I did not live, I think that was something that was kind of buzzing on the New York rap scene at that point. But, I lived in Columbus, Ohio. And the thing I always talk about is how the news here at that point traveled a little bit slower, or at least the way I could access the news was traveling a little bit more slowly. And so there's this interesting origin story for me with Doom that is not tied to like the survival of grief or this endurance to create a character who has lived beyond or lived in a world outside of a sadness that the actual real human knows, which that all is interesting to me too. But I was so fascinated by this idea of a very literal quote unquote villain persona playing out as we often see it played out in movies or in comic books, where it's always like villains and heroes, they kind of make their costumes out of whatever the fuck they got around the house. You know what I mean? Like, Spider-Man cutting some pajamas or whatever until a real mask or a real outfit or a real costume arrives. And so this idea of him in that 98, 97, 98, 99 era crafting the person who would eventually make Operation Doomsday is real fast. It's like more fascinating to me than almost anything else.
I've heard similar things, and there's an artist who worked with Doom. Doom was a graffiti writer.
Yeah.
And Doom created a lot of his own art, basically, and a lot of his own, like visual concepts, things like that. I think he created the Sambo drawing, actually, that is associated with KMD. But he also, in that era, he had the idea already of wanting to make it just about the music and to get away from, to kind of try to separate the art from the artist, right? To try to separate, and a lot of it has to do with, I think in some regard, probably does have to do with grief and other things as well, but it has to do also with like how glossy rap was becoming at that time, and kind of the bad boy era, and Jay-Z, and kind of Rockefeller, like a very sort of glamorous persona that was being donned in mainstream hip hop kind of across the board, even so far as like Q-Tip, After Tribe doing, Amplified.
Yeah.
And I think that part of Doom's rebellion against that was basically about like, hiding who I am, right? As like, there'll be sort of an avatar of me, but you're not going to be thinking about what I look like. And I think in the early phases of that, my understanding is he used like stocking caps and bandanas and things like that, right? And then he started working with that artist, and the artist helped him from the Marcus Aurelius gladiator helmet develop what became the mask. And the rest is history in terms of the mask itself.
I mean, I think there's also something, at least for me, to be said for detaching oneself from their production, whatever a person's productions are. And I think about that often when I think about this with Black artists especially, when I see this desire for people to consistently respond to things, respond to messes that often they did not make, right? All summer long, I watched Black thinkers, Black artists, Black creatives be asked to respond to the quote unquote moment, right? Which is, again, assuming that it's only a moment, right? There was this, land rush to get people to say something, to make sense of. I was thinking about this recently with Marvin Gaye, when in the album What's Going On. All these political albums that Black artists have made throughout their history are sometimes working out things on their own terms, but America imagines that these things are being worked out for their benefit, right? And it creates a situation where Black artists specifically are used as moral compasses or curiosity compasses, or, you know, you wrote about this thing once, can you tell me about this other thing? And I think there's something really useful about forcefully detaching oneself, the actual real person, from whatever their product might be or whatever their consumption point might be for the rest of the public. That, I mean, just the mask itself does that, but also making no bones about the fact that what you were listening to when you were listening to Doom was someone who was not only building a persona, but building an entire ecosystem through which that persona was operating in. And so that made it so that you, listener, had to, even if you understood KMD and Zev X and Daniel, like even if you understood the multitudinous nature of this person behind the mask, when tuning into a Doom record in any form, you had to kind of suspend that system of understanding and understand that you instead were listening to someone who had built an ecosystem outside of themselves. And that, I think, is immensely generous. I always talk in like writing workshops about how withholding is generous, because withholding allows for people's imaginations to flourish on their own, with whatever blueprint you've provided them and with whatever you've withheld from them. And I think Doom was a real master of brilliantly and artfully withholding. And through that withholding, I think we got so much more than we would have maybe gotten if he were to take the mask off and tell the story of his many heartbreaks or his many triumphs and losses.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's absolutely right. I think we probably should go back. So just for folks, again, like you can get all this information so many other places that we'll talk about it even more definitively than we will today. But with the second KMD record, what happened in a nutshell is that Elektra had released a song called Cop Killer. I don't know how recently before, but shortly before, right? And that created a ton of controversy. It was coming off of NWA, F the Police. I don't know why I'm not fuck the police. And, and basically was kind of at the time where there became like a real backlash against, it's kind of weird. I mean, it has to do with, a real racist backlash, right? Against like kind of artistic culture shift that was happening in society, where Black people were able to like speak for themselves unfiltered and artistically express themselves in all the ways that they wanted to. And KMD's album basically ends up, I guess I would sort of say, catching a stray in that controversy, because their album really isn't that controversial.
No.
It had a cover that had a Sambo that was hanging. And a lot of it, if you listen to Mr. Hood, if you follow Black Bastards, if you actually listen to that record, this was a character that Zev Love was kind of constantly battling with, right? That KMD was battling with. And in many ways, right, they wanted to destroy these negative stereotypes and perceptions of Black people, Black artists, right? And so this was something that they were consciously battling with on the first record. The cover basically upset some person, right? Some at Billboard, I think, was the magazine.
It was a Billboard, yeah.
Yeah. And they wrote like a big thing about it, but it was nothing like, I mean, it's really kind of strange when you compare it to like some of the albums that actually came out in that period. Basically, Elektra made the decision that they didn't want to deal with the controversy anymore, shelved it, and they did actually, I guess, pay KMD out some of their money, like their advance or something, and gave them their masters, which was, I mean, compared to like the way a lot of things go within the record industry at the time, a lot of the people that spoke to it kind of suggested that some elements of it were surprising, in that KMD walked away with its masters and with some money, but they got screwed. I mean, ultimately, right? Like they got dropped from the label, and they didn't get to put their album out, and they also got attached to this controversy. So go ahead.
Which I think that is the thing, right? Is they got attached to a controversy for an album that wasn't that controversial. Its shelving is what made it controversial. Much like, I mean, we see this thing throughout history, but it has to be said, I mean, '92 saw Paris's Sleeping with the Enemy released, right? And on that album, there's that song that like fantasizes about assassinating the president.
Yep.
Which, I mean, obviously, like I'm not that I don't say that with a judgmental tone. I love that album. I love Paris. Like I love Paris.
Great.
Yeah. So that's not like me shaking my like wagging my finger at Paris. It's just saying like this is.
Yeah, it was a coward move by Elektra.
Yeah, it was cowardly, right?
Yeah.
Because I think there's a way that even it's particularly because at that point there was a way that these kind of like bloodthirsty white execs would move to kind of capitalize on quote unquote controversy to push these records out, right? And so, you know, I don't want to say like missed opportunity, but it also that record is at least the record that I have heard in the form that I think that most people have heard is it's not controversial. It would not feel controversial to me if I had heard it then, I think either.
No, it definitely wouldn't. I mean, you know, you could compare it to a lot of other albums, again, like by the people in the milieu that we already discussed, right? Like whether that's, you know, Tribe, De La Soul, Leaders of the New School, Brand Nubian. It was in many ways a contrived controversy. And, you know, one of the things, I think it's Dante Ross, because he was their A&R at the time, right? And he talks about trying to advocate for it. And he basically said, you know, like Elektra folded on a couple levels. Like initially they were going to fight the cop killer controversy, and they ended up pulling that as well after a certain point. So they basically started out very, you know, like free speech, you know, our artists can say what they want to say. It's music, and caved on all fronts. And part of what Dante Ross pointed to, which is like basically the people who had the responsibility for advocating for KMD or who they were signed under, right? That they had signed Huey Lewis and the News previous to that, and their record had totally flopped, and they'd put out a couple other flops. And so part of it was like that the exec, you know, not the high level exec, but like the exec that KMD was under was sort of already losing their traction within Elektra. And so they didn't have the clout, right, to like argue it. Basically, people already thought they were doing a shitty job, right? So they were kind of like, yeah, we don't care about your records.
Yeah.
Which kind of makes some sense, not in terms of like justifying it, but just in terms of explaining what happened.
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, the music industry is a business, right? And so it runs on the same kind of capitalist and dismissive machinery that all American institutions of entertainment and living run on, which, you know, I think KMD was of course a victim of that, but I also don't know. I mean, I think had Mr. Hood been a bigger commercial success, you know, and it had some commercial success, don't get me wrong, and it was definitely a critical success, but if Mr. Hood had been, you know, a double platinum album, I think maybe the conversation around Black Bastards would have been different because of the way the industry is. Yeah,
definitely. I think that's true. Yeah, so like this happens, and then, you know, the timing of this, like I read it different ways in different places, and I think that probably has to do with like the memories of people who tell the stories. But right around the same time, Sub Rock dies, and he dies in a very strange way. You know, he dies crossing the Long Island Expressway, getting hit by a car. You know, and there's always like kind of a mystery around that itself that's not really, I think it's just sort of unspeakable. I hear interviews where people kind of come to the brink of saying something more and then sort of back away, like they know they can't say it. You know, so I'm not going to jump into like suggest what might have occurred there, right? But I think that, you know, those two things happening at the same time in your life, your musical partner, your brother, a brother you're so close to that like people refer to you as twins, etc., you know, dies, and you get dropped from your record label, and you're not getting, you know, your album that you actually have the masters to, nobody else wants now.
Yeah.
Because, you know, it's been tainted by Billboard and all of this controversy already, and they just don't want to touch it. So Doom just, you know, disappears, you know, from the scene for a few years there. I mean, I think he's come out and said in a couple interviews, I think, that, he dealt with a lot of different shit in that period. He's talked about struggling with homelessness, struggling with alcoholism, and you can imagine that occurring. And, I think we'll touch on this a little bit more as we progress through it, but I think that that's really important. And I think the important thing to understand about that too is that, music industry success, even people who are thought of as more successful than KMD was, is a very fleeting thing. And a lot of people reach that level of like major label success, strong independent success, whatever it is. And it's very short-lived, right? And their lived reality doesn't come in any way close to, especially once you get into the late 90s, right? What gets portrayed within music videos.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that is something that I didn't really realize until I lived in New York for 5 years and saw it myself. But it's an important thing to understand, like how you can go from being on a major label, having a major label deal. Elektra was a significant label. And, then you're homeless and alcoholic within a couple of years.
I mean, I think a thing that I really want to say is that, I mean, plainly, grief is hard and oftentimes unromantic and permanent. And I mean, again, I don't know because I was not around Doom and because I don't want to speak on the actual granular mechanics of what was happening in his life at that point. But I do think, to lose a brother, I mean, that anyone who knows my work or anything knows that I've lost a great many people in my life, and grief is difficult.
Yeah, for sure.
And I don't know if there is an effective apparatus for explaining the simplicity of that to people who are not moving through it. Not even at the same time of people. This is on a much lesser level. I remember my mother died the year before I went into high school, right? The summer before I went into high school. And that school year, I was fighting all the time as someone who, did not get in a ton of fights. I was fighting all the time. My grades are bad. I was getting kicked out of school repeatedly. And teachers were all, we don't understand this. What's happening? And it's like, the way that we as people are required to move forward through grief is untenable. It's untenable that people had to it's almost unthinkable that some people had to like reply to emails on the day after there was the day after white nationalists stormed the Capitol or whatever the fuck, you know what I mean? Like, and because of this, I think that I've really resisted getting too romantic about Doom's reinvention post Sub Rock's death, even though I know that it's there, right? It's the like shiny sign that is kind of easy to tap. But I think more so that if you truly love someone and then lose them, reinvention is perhaps your only option, because you're not the same person you were, and you're not ever going to be again. Not to pull too many threads into this, but, one thing that was, it's known that I'm a Minnesota Timberwolves fan, for better or worse currently and recently for most of my adult life. But, Karl Anthony Towns lost his mother and lost a lot of family members to COVID. In that interview he gave this interview after like the first game where he was like, yo, I am not the person you remember from back then. Like I'm a different dude than I was, before April. And so you're seeing the physical me, but I'm not who you think I am anymore. And it was really devastating to hear that. But at the same time, it's like, that's it. He's got it. Like I felt that so many times. And that is what I think about when I think about Doom from a sense of reinvention, is that grief is the greatest tool of reinvention, because for if you lose someone you love, you're living without that physical part of yourself that was intertwined with them. And so you have no choice but to be someone different than who you were. Of course, that doesn't always manifest itself in like a full career shift and an arc tied to another world, but sometimes that is the only way the world is livable for you anymore. Is if you have a place that you can escape to where you are someone other than yourself.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I think, I think the other thing that I agree, and I guess, part of what I would say also is I think this is important in terms of thinking about where Doom's career goes and the type of music he makes next, because I didn't really realize a lot of the internal dynamics around KMD production until the last few days of listening to a lot of people talk about that, right? That were actually, like in the room. But I think that it's really important to understand that, Doom took things 60, 70% a lot of the time. And then Sub Rock took it the last 30%. And that last 30% took it from sounding like basically a demo tape, right, to sounding like a finished record.
Right.
And I think that what you have, particularly with Operation Doomsday, because of kind of a confluence of things, is really the artist, right, that Doom was in a lot of ways, right? And and we can talk about, yes, there's a invention of a new character. He's rhyming about different stuff. There's certainly differences between Zevlov X as a person and what Doom is as a persona. But I think that idea is really important, right? That like he lost his access to major label studios and he lost his finisher,
Right.
and his partner, right? And I think that, and he stepped into when he does get around. Like, I think it's important to acknowledge the amount of time. There's about 4 years that pass for sure between like new recorded material. He does start to release 12 inches in like 96.
Yeah.
And does start to show up in the New Eurekan Cafe and other places in that time frame. And I think, this is something I talked about a little bit when he passed, is that it's important for people to understand that was a long period of time to be away from the industry or to be away from music in that, because we don't think about that way now anymore, I don't think, as much, but, hip hop from, wherever you want to start it is a recorded product, right? Like 79, 81, 84, whatever, like in that time frame to like the mid 90s. If you weren't releasing an album every year or every 2 years, people kind of forgot about you. And it was difficult for artists, specifically coming out of the 80s. I think about Rakim in that time frame and other folks, KRS-One to a certain extent. If they took a significant layoff, it became harder and harder to stay current and for people to think of them as still making kind of, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, I feel like there was an ethos within rap at that time that, any kind of prolonged hiatus was kind of,
it removed you from the conversation, right? No matter how great you were in some ways, because I mean, much like now, there's just so much that there was so much, and I think fewer ways to just keep up with people. Particularly again for like me living in the Midwest and not being, getting most of my rap news from the source, and that's it. And later XXL, but in the early mid 90s, it was only the sources, and rap, like these little mags, but there were fewer ways to kind of keep in touch and keep on the pulse of what people were up to. And so it was easier to fall out of the conversation, or to at least feel like you were falling out of the conversation or on the outskirts of the conversation. And I think it was easier to not have your return to the conversation be such a huge splash, an exciting splash, right?
Right.
Because of those same things.
I think of a lot of artists, right, who like kind of flopped when they tried to come back. And again, like, I think an important thing to think about is that like the industry really functioned under a lot of disposability logics in that time frame,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Like, so you were too old, whatever it was, right? Like ageism within rap at that time frame was a very big thing, and Doom wasn't old. Like I think it's important for people to understand. Sometimes I feel like sometimes he's older than he was. He was younger than Jay-Z, right? So it's like
Yeah.
for him to put out an album in 99, well, Jay-Z is still putting out albums, right? But in that time frame, you had a like, he left an era. KMD was in a specific era and a specific like time and place where you could be Long Island, you could be a like suburban rapper. There were a lot of them that were successful. They had like they cross pollinated. They showed up on each other's records, right?
Yeah.
And with the rise of like, both sort of Death Row on the West Coast and Bad Boy and, you know, some of the other groups like the Wu-Tang Clan, there's just like a little bit less space in the mainstream level for. I love a lot of Bad Boy records, right? Like,
I do too.
it's not that they're not artistic. It's a certain kind of artistry that went out of vogue, I guess I would say.
I mean, they were tapping, they were trying to get it. They were, at least with Bad Boy and Death Row. I mean, mainstream rap at that time was kind of tapping on a different door. It was trying to become significantly more even more commercially viable than it already was. And in some ways, post Tupac and Biggie's murders, it was trying to appease a different kind of fan, right? Because of the moral panic that was kind of happening. Yeah. And you mix those two things, and I am someone who is not opposed to, and very open in saying that I, partially because of where I was in my life, I didn't mind the Shiny Suit era. Now, do I listen to a lot of those records now? I mean, not really, but like, you got to remember, for me, I was like 15 or 16,
Yeah, I was a couple years older than you, but I agree. I mean, there became a certain point. For me, the point was around like, it was really as I started to get into certain artists, right? So as I started to get into like, it was really like 99, 2000, 2001, where the artists that I was listening to at that time began to sort of pose themselves in opposition to the mainstream.
Oh yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
and Doom is part of that in a certain way, although I think in a different way than some of the other artists that were in that same era. There were several of these periods in my music listenership growing up, but I kind of felt a need to pick sides, right? Or to go with what was being posed as authentic versus what was being posed as like, this glossy mainstream, whatever, right? And so it was very divided that way.
And that era was wild funny because you had a lot of folks like who were kind of in that realm of, who before the quote unquote Shiny Suit era were definitely in the like grimy, gritty, we're never going that route. Like I'll never forget when Mike Geronimo had the song with Puff. Yeah. And I was like, oh man, this is different. This is like not the Mike Geronimo I remember from the first album. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Or like OC
yeah,
did an album that was like much, really kind of trying to cross over a little bit. There were certain artists, right, that had been in the mid 90s with a grimier aesthetic, but then they became much more glossy.
I mean, it's cyclical. It's like when everyone was trying to get a Lil Wayne verse, I mean, it's like everyone kind of grasping for the moment, like Fat Joe had, the first Don Cartagena single had Puff on it. It was just one of those things. But I liked that there was an opposition party, so to speak. Like while I enjoyed some of those records, I just, from a pretty early age as a listener, particularly to hip hop, I just always understood that you go to different albums and different records for different things. Like I can't listen to Mace for everything, but there are some things that I listened to Mace for and enjoyed.
Right.
And so I kind of loved that there was this opposition party, and I loved Operation Doomsday because even though it was like fairly popular in the circles I was in. It wasn't super popular. This was back when I used to think that like having access to an album that not everyone was listening to was a personality trait. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um,
And to be clear, like that was fostered by these folks. I mean, like Bobbito wanted that,
right.
right? Like so Fondulum Records, like it released 3,000 copies or whatever, sold out, and then basically he parted ways with Doom, gave Doom his masters, shook hands, and Doom was the one who re-released it, like,
Right.
40 times or whatever. But it's, I mean, Stretch and Bobbito is a weird aesthetic that way, right? Like they were on the air from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. on Columbia's radio station.
Yeah.
And they debuted so many artists, right? I mean, I think most people have seen their documentary, et cetera. Nas, Biggie, Jay-Z, et cetera, right? Like big name folks. But they also were critical in this kind of, you mentioned the New Eurekan Cafe earlier, Lyricist Lounge, Fat Beats, place called Footwork. Like there were these little spots within New York. The mix of them created a scene that basically, starting around 95, 96, paved a way to support artists on an independent level, which was still not a given, of course, right? It's, you still got to be able to prove yourself within it. And so Doom comes around basically like 96, 97 and starts recording. He records Operation Doomsday, it sounds like, in like 2 to 3 weeks at Stretch Armstrong's house with access to his records. But there's interesting things within even Doomsday, is that like part of the aesthetic and the breakdown in aesthetics and like the disagreement, right? What people thought Bad Boy was doing wrong is that like there were purists in this generation, right, who would say, you want to look for rare drum loops, you want to dig for hours for like jazz samples, and you want to create music with obscure records, and it's going to have this kind of underground sound, right, or this unique sound. Everything's going to sound like, not like what everybody else is doing, right? And this is kind of like this independent aesthetic that's developing at the time. And then the counter to that, right, is like, well, I'm just going to sample a Diana Ross record and just loop it.
Just loop
right?
it.
Yeah. And that'll be the beat, right? And so the funny thing about Doom is that like he's like, well, I'm just going to loop this Sade record and put scratches by Scott LaRock over the top of it, and that'll be my beat. And so actually, like from a production ethos for him at that time, he was out of line with what, the quote unquote underground aesthetic was, and was actually in some ways closer to the sort of principles around production in terms of beat making that might have been on mainstream. But it was more about the presentation of things, right? It was more about, on one thing's like he was pressing his records straight from like cassettes,
Right.
And so the there's like production quality stuff. I mean, you listen to those records and like sometimes an MC's off beat for a couple bars, right? And it's just the way that it comes out. And, so it's totally not, it's not studio quality, rap music in a lot of ways.
And it's like, a big thing I loved about that record too is that it featured Curious George, who I loved when I was young. I mean, I loved The Constipated Monkey, and then he is another rapper who kind of we didn't hear from for a minute. And so I think that Doom was always so good at kind of nodding back to the folks he loved and the folks he wanted to be on things with. I don't know. I'm big on not just collectives but collaborative work in music, and I think Doom is a singularly great collaborator who did not mind, like all great collaborators, had a vision but didn't seem to mind sacrificing it for the greater good of someone else's vision. I mean, I think the Grimm stuff is a good testament to that. Of course, I mean, obviously Mad Villainy is as well, but that Danger Mouse joint, that I feel like I don't know what the vibe was on that for folks everywhere, but I remember, Danger Mouse is fine. Danger Mouse is like not one of my most favorite producers in history, but it seemed like that album really brought a lot out of him in a way that was really exciting to me.
Yeah, yeah. I think one of the things that's interesting to think about just in terms of that collaboration aspect with Doom is that, like, I've kind of pieced together from multiple interviews that I've heard too that, like, Doom didn't his vision was fairly limited in a certain way, right? Like he would create, if he was doing beats, right, he would create the beat.
Yeah.
If he was doing the beat and the rhyme, he would like do the beat and the rhymes. And if he was collaborating with somebody, right, like, he talks about collaborating with Madlib, and one of the things that he said is like, and this is Doom saying it himself, is that they didn't speak to each other that much,
Right.
So they were living in the same house at the time, and which has a studio in it, etc. But he would go hang out with Madlib. They'd smoke a blunt or whatever. They'd listen to some beats. He'd hear the beats. He'd pick the ones that he wanted. Right, go write, record, bring it back. Right, and so like, and obviously like Madlib is a genius too, and so Madlib's doing all kinds of things himself as well on that record. But there was not, the way Doom describes it, like there was not a grand, like they weren't sitting talking about like what's the concept of this album or what's the what are we trying to accomplish with this specific song. It was much more of a feel, and the music is how they spoke to each other, sort of, to put it into the way Doom talks about it. And I think that's interesting because it's also somewhat the way that Dante Ross talks about him in Sub Rock.
Yeah.
Is that they actually use the term like telepathy. I've heard that a couple of different times of like that, you kind of didn't know, and Stretch, I think back to Doomsday for a second, Stretch also talks about Doom being in his house recording this album and that he never gave Doom a bed to sleep in. But Doom was there for like 2 weeks, and he said, Doom would just fall asleep, right? And sleep for a few minutes and then, or however long he needed to, right? And then get back up and keep working. And I think that that's like, he had a very workmanlike approach to his music. And obviously, his rhymes are extremely intricate. There's a lot going on, a lot of internal rhyme, a lot of wordplay. But, in terms of like, and I'm sure, right, he had broader conceptual thoughts that he's working with. But it doesn't seem like there was a lot of like collective visioning.
He's also, and I know that people have talked about this, but he was also just fun, like plainly, and this goes back to KMD, his sense of humor was something that always warmed me. It always made me feel good.
Right.
Because in no mode of his career, from KMD to any collaborative effort to solo albums, he seemed to take the work seriously. He seemed to take his central concerns seriously, but he didn't take himself seriously he allowed himself to not take himself fully seriously as a deliverer of a message. And I think that is something that, for me, I admired and aspired towards, even though I'm not particularly, I think I'm sometimes too serious in my work compared to how I am in my actual living. But there was something I really enjoyed about that. As someone who, because what I think I liked or what I think I praised about the shiny suit era was less about the shiny suits, right? It was less about like, I don't really care about or less about the expressions of wealth even. It was more about the idea that these were just a lot of rappers who were committing to having fun. But Doom's ability to do that kind of for a prolonged stretch and to do it in a way that wasn't tied to how much he had gained, financially specifically, was really thrilling and exciting to me. And I think goes back to these ideas I have about how just him building a character for himself and not making himself as a person the vehicle for his work is in some ways, a rejection of these ideas that are often pushed into the marketplace about access and what people deserve, quote unquote, from people who create things.
Yeah. And I think this, like, a really important thing to understand about Doomsday and about the era that it comes out of, right, is that this is really the creation of independent rap music. And, I don't want to overstate Doom's individual role in that because it starts before him. There's a lot of other significant artists that are coming about at the same time in New York, but also like all around the US. But I think that one of the things that's really important and unique about Doom's story and his reemergence is that, he chose to work with Babito on his label.
Yeah.
He, worked with a label, was going to put it out, make 3,000 copies. He knew they'd split profits 50-50. He knew he'd get his masters at the end of it. And as I imagine it, he had a very utilitarian approach to that album, did what he needed to do. And then, he continues working with a variety of independent labels after that. His work with MF Grimm, Grimm establishes a label called Day by Day Entertainment. They do some collaborations. Grimm puts out some music as well. Doom produces some of it. This was important to me, as I mentioned to you before the call, as like Grimm was the first rapper that I knew of that was in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
And there was also a story with Grimm about him getting, he was in a wheelchair because he was shot, right? Because somebody tried to kill him.
Right.
And Grimm ended up going to prison for a short stint as well. And, there was a thing, it's kind of what you talked about earlier about like looking out for his people and kind of staying connected to folks that were in the KMD milieu. But the alliance of Doom and Grimm, I think, was special in a lot of ways because to me, it was very much saying, like, Grimm, just so people know a little bit about him, he's a rapper. He was known as the Grim Reaper before he was MF Grimm. He had a little buzz going himself at a certain point.
Yeah, Gravediggers. Gravediggers is like a whole, yeah.
I'm not sure he's the same Grim Reaper from Gravediggers.
I feel like he is. Hold on. The California, the not the Gravediggers who are.
Oh, there's two different ones. Okay.
Yeah. Not the New York ones.
Yep.
My bad. That always fucked me up. There's like.
Right. He worked with Rock Rada. Okay. Yep.
Yeah. There's obviously, the other Gravediggers are more definitely, I think, more well known.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was confused with. But anyways, yeah, I mean, so he had a little bit of a buzz himself that was derailed by all of this personal tragedy as well. And I think that at that time, there's a couple of things that are important to say. One is that the way that you got a record deal in that era, right, was you created a buzz, you created a demo, you gave that demo to different people, you got on shows like Stretch and Bobbito, and you either got signed or you didn't get signed. And getting signed at that time meant a major label.
Yeah.
And that went however it went. When you got dropped, you were done, basically. If you got on, maybe you could shift to different labels like other artists did, etc. But it was a very sort of one track that all involved these large capitalist music labels, right? What started to happen with like Fondulum, with Raucous to a certain extent, although that's a complicated story a little bit, because Rupert Murdoch's son owned it, etc. And it ended up going to Priority, etc. But what started to happen was you did start to have these like boutique labels. Stone's Throw emerges in like 97, 98. Like there's a series of them. A lot of them don't exist anymore, and some of them do. But it became a different potential avenue. The first release that Fondulum put out was Cenobite, which included Kool Keith, right, who's kind of fits into that mold a little bit. And in a lot of ways, I think was a very important figure for MF Doom in terms of like seeing, I know that they were fans of Ultramagnetic in KMD. And, I think that Keith being able to reinvent himself was something that Doom probably saw as well. And I know that they recorded together eventually. But there was a creation of like a potential other avenue. A lot of it was kind of underground rap in the sense that it was not selling a lot of copies. It was not necessarily something that was sustaining anybody financially. And Doom and Grimm are kind of like, they're fighting against those logics of industry disposability, as I see it, trying to like mutually support each other and create a lane for their friends along the way too.
Yeah, which I mean, I think that if there is one blueprint, there are many blueprints that I've taken from Doom as a creative person or a person who aims to be creative, as he like lived his creative life, and that I will continue to take, now that we have lost him. But one of them is just being thoughtful about the way that I attempt to work and who I attempt to bring into my work, and how generously I can think through what I give of myself and what parts I give of myself to the people who most deserve it. It feels like Doom was so thoughtful about that. And I do want to say too, without getting too far down the road, I so appreciated, and I'm very, it is wonderful to me in some ways that his family got some time to grieve on their own before sharing the news publicly.
Mm.
And that too made me think about access and what people believe they have access to. And I don't know all the time. The world stood still, of course, when the news was delivered, or at least my corners of the world did. But I cannot imagine what his family had to move through before they shared that news publicly. And I'm thankful that they got to move through it. I'm really thankful that they got to be thoughtful about the when and how when it comes to the sharing of the news.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's interesting with that too, I think, is that like, from what I've gathered from some of the interviews that have come out since, like, it seems like they had some other folks that were aware of the news, right? But everybody kept their mouth shut.
Yeah.
And I think that's like also speaks to like a certain kind of community and generosity. And I think about that too when I think about Stretch and Bobbito's relationship to Doom as well, right? Of like, they're interesting. Stretch and Bobbito are interesting figures in hip hop history, right? In that like they were not, they both had like relationships to major labels at some point, basically didn't want anything to do with that world at that point. Bobbito has said he called Fondlem Records Fondlem as like a fuck you to the industry. And Stretch talks about that it means a lot to him that he was able to provide his crib to Doom to record that album, right? At a time when he felt like Doom really needed it. And I think that there is a lot to be said. And I think it, maybe it changes a little bit later on in Doom's career as he becomes really successful, because he does. But I think that certainly in this era of like 99 until like 03, 04, when he really starts to blow up in a bigger way, it seems like there's a lot of generosity and collectivity there.
Yeah. Which, if one's legacy is that of generosity, then it's not a bad way to live, or it's not a bad way to have lived. And, I'm someone who, my relationship with loss always begins with gratitude, or it always comes from a place of gratitude. I'm always just thankful to have been alive and to have a life that not only intersected with Doom's life, but was enhanced by it. That is not guaranteed. It is not guaranteed that any of us live a life alongside someone who excites, inspires, and or makes us look at the world differently. And so, I'm mostly thankful that I got to participate in his vision for as long as I did.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much. I mean, and one of the things that I've appreciated, I guess, and since his passing, is like going back and revisiting so much of it and realizing how much is he left a lot of amazing work with us. Yeah. I we're not going to be able to cover everything. I think it's important to sort of talk about then, though, a little bit like the sort of '03 to like '05, '06 span of Doom, which is just album after album,
Yeah.
And like you said, like there's really the only solo album in there is Food. But, the rest of the work in there is a collaboration, a lot of times between him and different producers. Like you said, Danger Mouse, Madlib, but like there's a lot. There's a couple albums in there that I didn't think were great at the time, and a couple of them that I don't think have aged that well. But there's a lot of incredible music.
Yeah. And
I think some of the stuff that didn't age that well, like there was like a Victor Vaughn 2 album that, like I'm in my mind, like knowing Doom a little bit in terms of how it, like, I think some of this might have been like, okay, this is a contractual obligation, right? Or this is somebody who paid him a certain amount of money for him to send verses to, right?
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that I do think about with Doom that I've heard from folks, right, is that like he was able to create a lane where rap was his work. It was his career, which was unusual for somebody who lost a major label deal. That meant that during certain times in his life, he had to rap a whole lot and sell verses, right?
Right.
And I think that in itself created a certain blueprint for certain rappers, right, who might have been through some similar circumstances. And I think that that's an interesting, like there was a period for Rock Marciano where like it seemed like all he was doing was selling verses to people, right?
Right.
And I think he sold them for $1,000 each, right? So it's like, hey, if I can sell 100 verses this year, then I'm going to make $100,000, right? And I think that, those are Doom really, in my mind, that's one of the ways that actually he's most innovative is sort of in creating different opportunities for people to work with rap music. Obviously, you have to have the skill and the talent, right? Which a lot is the level that Doom had was very high, and a lot of people that try to do it don't have that. But for people that are similar to him in that, like, they had enough talent at one point to get a major label deal, or they were a really strong independent artist or whatever, it created sort of a model of sustainability to a certain extent.
Right. Yeah. Which, though, I mean, and I will say that I am someone who is just resigned to the fact that nothing ages well, and maybe nothing should, or in the rare times where something ages well, it should be a real celebration. But I'm not committed to most things age well. And I do think that Doom was maybe at his best when it seemed was not entirely beholden to productivity, but of course, at least in the current construct of society and what it was when he was creating, there was a type of productivity required for survival. But, some of that, too, was just because I think his most productive mode was maybe one that didn't necessarily allow him to be as thoughtful about storytelling sometimes, which is, I think, what his greatest mode was. I mean, he was a world builder. He was like but I do think Food kind of gets back to golden's. I mean, he had such a great 2004.
Mm-hmm.
His 2004 is, I think, better than most years for most rappers ever.
Right.
And yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to say beyond that. He had the 3 albums, all of them like just stunning works, and yeah, it's almost unfair that anyone could produce at that level over the course of 1 year. To have those 3, of course, I'm sure those things were produced in over a long stretch of time, but have those 3 releases run down in 1 year.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting, I think, because coming out of that, he almost set a bar that like was impossible to reattain. And I remember in that moment thinking like, this guy's going to just continue to release like incredible music forever, and he does have a couple of good albums that come out later. I mean, I think that Born Like This is excellent.
Yeah.
I actually think the JJ Doom album, while it's an imperfect album, has some really great moments. This is one of the things I think that becomes the legacy of 2004 is that then there become these albums that everybody's expecting from Doom. One of them is Mad Villainy 2. The other one is the collaboration with Ghostface, which goes through different names, but they finally land on...
Oh, Doomstarks.
Doomstarks, right?
Yeah.
They finally go to Doomstarks. And like these become really hyped projects that basically never come to light in proper form. And maybe something will come out, but like one of the things Peanut Butter Wolf, who's he owns Stone's Throw Record, he said that Doom had given them like 11 songs for Mad Villainy 2. And then over time, he kept saying like, oh, let me record 3 or 4 more, 4 or 5 more. That this is, and this is just Peanut Butter Wolf's side of the story, of course. We don't get the full, you can't have Doom's side of the story necessarily, but that didn't really happen. And that then what started to happen is that those verses that were given to them would show up on other people's records. And I think that, there's one thing about Doom that I think is important to say is that like, he really didn't adhere to any sort of industry norms and standards. We've already talked about that kind of within his beat production, how he didn't really adhere to like what the underground aesthetic was at the time. But he also, and this was part of like his mystery and controversy, like he would book shows and he would send other people in the mask to do the show sometimes. And he also did this thing where like he used his beats pretty liberally and you would see them show up in multiple places sometimes. And like these are big no-nos in the industry, but at the same time, that's also part of who he was. And I think it's part of one on his side. I mean, he said about the Doom Poster scandal that like he did it so people would talk about it and people are asking for more shows now than they were before, right? So there's always this mischievous side, I think, to it,
right?
Sort of villain persona. But there's also, I think, a part of him from stories that I hear, right, of like he just didn't give a fuck about these rules, right? And I think it's too bad on one way that we didn't get some of those albums, and hopefully we'll still hear some good music that will come out later. But I'm happy with all that we have, and I don't feel like he needs to, give us more.
No,
but I think that kind of mischievous aspect and the sort of bucking of all these rules, which really are in the place, right, for, these are property relations, right? These are rules that capitalism imposes, right?
Right.
And, he really didn't care about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, being in opposition to so much of what I think about is the kind of capitalistic notions of production and, who you are if you're not working or providing work to the masses. And to find some kind of peace, I think this too is world building an alter ego or a villain as well. To find some peace with not caring about that is also another blueprint that Doom offered. But I think that very plainly too, and I didn't see, and I know that a lot of people have written a lot of things and have said a lot of things, very plainly, I never want it to be lost that the dude could just like flat out rap, you know what I mean? And I think that because there's so much to talk about around him and around his body of work and around the persona and around the physical aspect of the mask and history, that is all fine and important and contextualizes the work. But also, I just never wanted to be lost that this dude could rap better than most people rapping. And I don't ever want to take good rappers for granted, right? Because there are not many great rappers, in my opinion. And I know that we are kind of at a point in our internet consumption and just the world where hyperbole kind of rules the day. And what that does is like readjusts, it kind of readjusts the discourse for people knowing when something is like okay, or struggling to parse out when something is like just fine. When for me, a lot of things are just fine. I enjoy a lot. I enjoy a great many things that are just fine, right? I don't require excellence for enjoyment, which kind of gets back to the thing where it's like I listen to Mace records for reasons that aren't necessarily because Mace is the greatest living rapper or whatever. But I think when there is excellence, when there is something I can point to and say, that is excellent, that is singular, I never want that to get lost as a part of a person's legacy. And so, for me to put like a real stamp on all of this, it's important to not lose the fact that Doom was an immensely skilled rapper, a great rapper.
Yeah.
Better than a lot of his peers, and someone who I think pushed some of his peers to be better, which is wildly important. Like, not just to be better rappers, but to be better visionaries, to be better stewards of their own images, to be better and more thoughtful world builders. And that is important too.
Any parting thoughts that you want to offer, or do you want to just kind of close it there?
I mean, one parting thought I will say is that I think there's a lot of lessons to be had about understanding grief and how grief sits in a person and shifts a person and does it in ways that aren't always glamorous, that aren't always romantic. And I hope that people allow themselves to sit with that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the other important thing that we should say is obviously, Doom dies young here. He also had a son who passed away a couple of years ago, and he did interviews, right? But he didn't talk a lot about personal stuff, partly, I mean, it has to do with all the reasons that we've talked before. I think because it's dark and there's a lot of grief there, but also because that's part of how he set himself as an artist up, is that he wouldn't have to talk about himself. He could talk about his art and how it was made.
And it's a question of what people get access to, right?
Yeah.
Like what people are allowed access to. And sometimes our grief is not something that I think people, all like the wide public, deserves access to.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. I really appreciate you having this conversation with me.
No, this was a real pleasure. Thank you for having me. And I appreciate, y'all, I love the show, and it's always an honor to be on.